What if everything you learned about Jesus was merely the surface of a much deeper and carefully veiled truth? What if the Gospels were codes, hidden layers of a spiritual map meant only for those who had eyes to see and ears to hear? Since the early centuries of Christianity, documents have been suppressed, alternative Gospels have been banned, and a new narrative has been constructed, shaping Jesus not as the initiator of souls, but as a symbol of passive worship. Yet between the lines of the scriptures, in the Gnostic texts discarded by orthodoxy, and in the teachings rescued by brave scholars, another Jesus resurfaces, a master of esoteric wisdom, bearer of a code that leads to ascension, not just to the beyond, but to conscious transformation, here and now. For millennia, the true purpose of Christ's message was deliberately shrouded by a web of dogmas, liturgies, and power structures. The vibrant and dynamic spirituality he taught became a rigid institution. However, the echoes of truth were never completely erased. Within Gospels like those of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Philip, there are clues left for those who dared to look beyond the surface. These texts were labeled as heresy, not because they lacked truth, but because they revealed too much. They invited the seeker to find the kingdom of God within themselves, without the need for intermediaries or institutions. This was the danger. An awakened human being cannot be controlled. A being who accesses the inner Christ becomes sovereign. The rise in this context is not a physical departure to heaven, but the vibrational elevation of the being. It is the release of the ego, the transmutation of the lower self, and the fusion with divine consciousness. Jesus, like the great masters who preceded and succeeded him, knew this path. He not only spoke about it, he embodied it. His miracles, his words, and even his crucifixion were part of an initiatory process that symbolically taught how to escape the prison of the conditioned mind and enter the state of unity with the whole. But this truth requires spiritual maturity to be understood. It cannot be swallowed without reflection. Therefore, it was encoded. The history we know is told by the winners, and the winners in the case of Christianity were those who institutionalized faith, turning an internal journey into an external practice. At the Council of Nicaea, for example, in the year 325, many Gospels were excluded. Jesus was formally declared the only Son of God, and any more symbolic, mystical, or human interpretation of his figure was condemned. The multiplicity of interpretations was reduced to a single path of worship. But even so, something escaped. The inner fire of gnosis, the direct knowledge, survived in secret orders, hidden manuscripts, and parallel traditions. It survives today, increasingly accessible for those who feel the call to see beyond. Those who search for this hidden code need to understand that it is not written in common language. It is symbolic, allegorical, and deeply spiritual. The parables of Jesus were not children's stories. They were initiatory tools. When he said, "Those who have ears to hear, let them hear," he was speaking to the initiates, those who had already awakened or were about to awaken. The key to deciphering these messages lies in the willingness to abandon prefabricated truths. It takes courage to cross the desert of illusions and come face to face with one's own bare soul, without masks. The path is narrow, not because God is selective, but because few are willing to let go of their certainties. Jesus, contrary to what is taught in many traditions, did not come to be worshipped. He came to be followed, not in the external sense, but internally. "I am the way, the truth, and the life" is not an invitation to idolatry, but a call to awaken the divine essence in each of us. It's a reminder that Christ is not a person, but a state of consciousness. This is the key that the ancient masters kept alive, the code that leads to ascension. And like every code, it requires careful reading, spiritual interpretation, and transformative practice. The early Christians, known as Gnostics, understood this dimension. They did not expect salvation to come from the outside. They knew that the true temple was the body, that prayer was a direct connection, and that enlightenment was not a post-death reward, but a state of being. That's why they were persecuted. That's why their works were burned and their teachings distorted. But the fragments survived. And now, in the midst of an era of revelation and access to information, these pieces of the spiritual puzzle are being rediscovered by thousands around the world. Once again, we are faced with the opportunity to access the secret. Behind the veil of religion, there is a map for the transformation of consciousness. This map is embroidered with symbols, numbers, archetypes, and metaphors. The miracles of Jesus, for example, were not simply supernatural events. Each one represents an internal healing process, a stage in the journey of the initiate. Turning water into wine is more than a magical act. It is the transmutation of emotion into wisdom. Healing the blind represents opening the eyes of the soul. Resurrecting Lazarus is to revive the one who had spiritually died. Everything has a deeper purpose. The figure of Jesus as Christ is the archetype of the divinized human being. It's not just about a historical man, but a consciousness that can be activated within all of us. This is what initiatory schools have always taught. Christ is not a name, it's a frequency, and the code left by him is within the seeker himself. He is not in churches, not in dogmas, not in magic formulas. He is in the inner silence, in the conscious practice, and in alignment with unconditional love. Therefore, this secret was hidden, because it cannot be sold, it cannot be controlled, and it cannot be institutionalized. But the time for silence has ended. We are living in a unique moment in human history where access to truth is expanding. What was once reserved only for monks, initiates, and hermits can now be found by anyone willing to look within. The code of ascension is alive, pulsating, waiting to be awakened. And this video is more than an explanation. It is an invitation, a call to remember who you truly are. Not a sinner seeking redemption, but a divine spark on a journey back to your sacred origin. Therefore, if you've made it this far, it wasn't by chance. There is something in you that recognizes this call, something that resonates with this forgotten wisdom. Perhaps you are just starting your journey. Maybe you are already in the middle of the desert, or perhaps you are on the verge of awakening. It doesn't matter. What's important is that the path has been opened. And as you lift the veil of history, you will begin to see with the eyes of the Spirit what has always been there, the living Christ within you, waiting to be remembered. Throughout the centuries, the language of spiritual truth has never been literal. Great masters have always used symbolic codes to convey messages that could only be understood by those who had already awakened to some degree. Jesus was no exception. His words were not just beautiful moral expressions, they were keys, spiritual mechanisms designed to open internal portals in the minds and hearts of those who would listen with true attention. The parables, often treated as simple stories to teach morality, actually concealed universal secrets. These secrets were not intended for the masses, but for those who were ready to receive the true teaching, the initiates. That's why he said, "To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not." It was not about exclusion, but about inner readiness. This symbolic language is not an invention of Christianity. It is a millennial heritage present in various spiritual traditions and initiatory schools. Ancient Egypt, for example, based its transmission of sacred knowledge on symbols, myths, and rituals. The Hebrew Kabbalah constructs entire worlds with letters and numbers. Hermeticism speaks of correspondences between visible and invisible worlds. When Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is within you, he is not just comforting, he is affirming that salvation is not external, but an internal journey of discovery. This phrase, simple at first glance, is a revelation of cosmic proportions. It breaks with any idea of intermediaries, dogmas, physical temples, or religious rules. It points directly to the divine that dwells in every human being. The parables of the sower, the barren fig tree, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, and so many others are authentic treatises of spiritual alchemy. The parable of the sower, for example, describes the levels of consciousness where the truth can or cannot flourish. The fertile soil is the open heart, receptive, ready to transcend the illusions of the world. The fig tree that bears no fruit represents spiritual stagnation, a life without the fruits of the Spirit. The Samaritan is the one who transcended the boundaries imposed by religion and society to live love in its purest form. Each of these narratives contains multiple layers, and each layer reveals something new when the seeker is prepared. The rational mind, conditioned by a literalist education, tends to reject or minimize the power of the symbol. However, the symbol speaks directly to the soul, bypassing the ego's defenses. It activates deep archetypes, realities that are beyond the intellect. For this reason, spiritual symbols are eternal. They withstand time, cultures, and languages. They touch a universal language. Jesus understood this deeply and used this tool masterfully. He knew that truth, when imposed, generates resistance, but when veiled in symbols, it finds its way to the recesses of consciousness. And so he taught, not with imposition, but with subtle invitations to reflection and inner revelation. Many of these symbols are also linked to numbers. Sacred numerology, present in the teachings of Jesus, is a vital code for decoding the scriptures. The 12 apostles represent not only historical disciples, but aspects of the human being in the process of harmonization. The 40 days in the desert speak of purification cycles. The number 7, recurrent in healings and miracles, represents totality, spiritual perfection. The crucifixion itself, which occurred at Golgotha, meaning place of the skull, clearly indicates that the process of ascension occurs within the mind, in the field of consciousness. It is the symbolic death of the ego and the rebirth of the superior soul. One of the greatest symbols left by Jesus is the idea that the Christ is not just him, but a universal principle, a divine spark that can be activated in any human being. This appears in his deepest speeches, such as, "You are gods," or "Greater works than these shall you do." These phrases have been relegated to the background because they deconstruct the entire structure of spiritual dependence. They point to the real possibility that everyone can reach the same level of Christ consciousness, not as an act of presumption, but as the natural blossoming of those who follow the path of inner truth. This is the hidden code that awakens the divine spark in each one. The ancient initiates knew that the symbol is the bridge between the visible and the invisible world. The bread and wine at the Last Supper are not just food. They represent the body and blood of Christ consciousness, the integration of matter and spirit. The supper is a ritual of unification with the divine essence. Baptism, in turn, is not just a physical act of purification, but a symbolic immersion in higher consciousness, a rebirth into a new reality. When Jesus walks on water, he is not defying the laws of physics, but demonstrating the supremacy of awakened consciousness over emotional chaos. The waters have always represented the unconscious and feelings. The symbolic language of Jesus also has a profound connection with silence. In various passages, he withdraws to pray alone, to meditate, to connect with the source. Silence is the space where the symbol germinates. External noise blocks the subtle. The initiate knows that the greatest revelations are not in the spoken words, but in what resonates behind them. That's why so many of Jesus' teachings are short, dense, enigmatic. They were not made to be memorized, but to be lived, felt, decoded with the heart. Silence is where the symbol transforms into wisdom. The parable of the pearl of great price is another example. A man sells everything he has to buy a single pearl. This represents the abandonment of all worldly distractions to seek the absolute truth, the hidden gem at the bottom of the ocean of consciousness. So too is the process of awakening. It requires renunciation, focus, surrender. The symbol of the pearl is profound. It is born from friction, pain, pressure. It is the product of a long internal transformation. Jesus used these images not by chance, but to provoke the seeker to reflect on their own journey of spiritual refinement. Within the Gnostic tradition, which preserves part of this knowledge, Jesus is seen as a revealer of the inner Christ. The Gnostic schools did not seek to idolize, but to understand. Their readings of the scriptures were symbolic, multidimensional. They saw the material world as a field of illusion and self-knowledge as the key to liberation. Symbolic language was the method, and awakening was the goal. For these seekers, the cross, the empty tomb, the miracles, and even the virgin birth had internal meanings, nothing to do with historical facts, and everything to do with states of consciousness. Spiritual ignorance is born from the literal reading of universal truths. When symbols are treated as raw facts, the light of understanding goes out. It is necessary to go beyond the surface. The symbol requires surrender, presence, contemplation. And more than that, it demands a life aligned with what it reveals. Jesus taught by example, with a look, with a gesture. Each of his steps was loaded with sacred intention. He was the very living symbol of the union between the human and the divine, and he invited everyone to follow this same path. The true reading of Christ's message is initiatory, not institutional. It's poetic, not dogmatic. It's liberating, not imposing. The symbols he used were designed to cross millennia and continue awakening souls in all ages. They remain active, vibrating in the collective unconscious of humanity. And as more people open up to this symbolic frequency, the light of understanding spreads faster. The code is not lost. It's alive, waiting to be read with the eyes of the Spirit. Every true transformation begins within. The external world, with its illusions of power, wealth, and fleeting glories, is merely a reflection of what quietly pulses within the human soul. Jesus, in his deepest essence, taught that the path to ascension was not a paved road outside of us, but a secret journey that unfolds within the self. When he stated, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he was not pointing to his figure as an idol to be worshipped, but to a state of consciousness to be attained. The way is not a geographical trail. It is an internal process, a rite of passage that every truth seeker must traverse to awaken the divine spark that dwells within. This inner journey, interpreted in different spiritual traditions, always appears under symbolic images of death and rebirth. In Egypt, the mysteries of Osiris spoke of the descent into the underworld and the rebirth in a glorified form. In the Hindu tradition, the cycle of samsara represents repetition until the soul achieves moksha, liberation. Among alchemists, it was described as the transmutation of lead into gold. In all cases, the metaphor is the same: to abandon the old self, with its limitations and attachments, so that the new being, united with the divine, may arise. Jesus expressed this in each teaching, showing that the true life is that of the awakened spirit, not that of the flesh imprisoned by the ego. Jesus' call was simple and at the same time revolutionary. "If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me." This is not a call to suffering, as it has been interpreted for centuries, but a clear initiatory instruction. Denying oneself means to transcend the ego, false identifications, and the illusion of separation. Taking up the cross is to consciously undertake the process of transformation, accept the death of the lower self so that the divine self can manifest. Following him is to walk the inner path, in which each challenge, each fall, and each overcoming are part of the refinement of the soul. This inner journey is filled with symbols of purification. The 40 days of Jesus in the desert are not just a historical episode, but the description of a seeker's stage, facing temptations, silencing the voices of the mind, and emerging strengthened, ready to fulfill his spiritual mission. The desert is the empty space, the arid terrain of solitude, where there are no external distractions and only the confrontation with one's own shadow remains. There, the masks fall, the fears emerge, and the soul is tested. Whoever crosses this internal desert discovers that true strength does not come from the world, but from the connection with the divine source. The journey of the soul is, therefore, a gradual climb, like steps that elevate consciousness to increasingly subtle states. Jesus taught that the kingdom of heaven is not a place in the future, but a reality accessible now, when the soul awakens. Each parable, each gesture, each miracle was a representation of this process. The healing of the blind symbolizes opening spiritual eyes to see the truth. The liberation of the possessed symbolizes expelling the internal shadows that enslave us. Walking on water is the victory of consciousness over emotional turbulence. Everything points to the same truth. The path is internal and requires courage, discipline, and surrender. Throughout history, many have confused religion with spirituality, and in this misunderstanding, the true teaching was lost. Jesus never sought to establish an institution. His mission was to awaken consciousness. He spoke from the direct experience of union with the divine and invited everyone to this same experience. "The Father and I are one" is not a phrase of exclusivity, but a revelation of human destiny. We are all called to recognize this unity. The internal path is precisely the journey that leads us from this sense of separation to the certainty of unity, from fragmentation to wholeness. This process does not happen automatically. It requires practice, dedication, and vigilance. Watch and pray was Jesus' constant instruction. Watching means observing the mind, the impulses, the thoughts that lead to illusion. Praying means aligning with the divine frequency, not just in words, but in state of being. Prayer, in this sense, is a practice of continuous connection, a dive into the inner silence where the voice of the source can be heard. It is in the silence of the heart that the soul receives guidance, and it is in this sacred listening that the seeker finds direction for their journey. The inner path is also marked by detachment. Jesus said, "Do not store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, but store up treasures in heaven." Detachment does not mean rejecting material life, but not clinging to it as if it were the only reality. The true treasure is the awakening of consciousness, inner peace, acquired wisdom, lived love. These are the eternal fruits that no external circumstance can steal. Following the path is learning to live in the world without being of the world, to use things without being used by them, to possess without being possessed. The journey of the soul is also a process of integration. Jesus did not ask us to deny human life, but to live it consciously, uniting the human and the divine within us. He said, "Be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." This perfection is not the absence of flaws, but fullness, completeness, integration of opposites. It is to recognize the shadow and the light, to accept pain and joy, and to transform everything into learning for evolution. The inner path is not an escape from life, but a deep dive into it, with awareness and love. It is on this journey that one discovers that ascension is not a single distant event, but a series of small daily elevations. Each time we forgive, we ascend. Each time we choose love over fear, we ascend. Each time we quiet the mind and listen to the soul, we ascend. The process is continuous, gradual, and culminates in a transformation so profound that the very human identity dissolves into the light of the inner Christ. This is the destiny of all who walk the path with faith and determination. That's why Jesus stated, "He who perseveres until the end will be saved." Perseverance is the key. The inner journey requires patience because each step of the spiritual ladder must be lived, experienced, integrated. There are no shortcuts. Every tear, every challenge, every fall are part of the soul's refinement. Just as gold is purified in fire, consciousness is refined in life's trials. The seeker who understands this stops resisting difficulties and starts using them as fuel for his ascent. The inner path is not easy, but it is the most sublime of all. In the end, the journey of the soul is a return home to the essence, to the state of unity that has always been the ultimate reality. Jesus came to remind us of this, that we are not fallen beings seeking redemption, but divine consciousnesses that have forgotten their origin and only need to awaken. The inner path is, therefore, a process of remembrance. It is remembering who we have always been, where we came from, and where we will inevitably return. And each step taken on this path is a step towards freedom, peace, and the light that never goes out. The 40 days in the desert are perhaps one of the most enigmatic episodes of Jesus' life, and at the same time, one of the most revealing for those who understand the language of symbols. The narrative describes a period of fasting, silence, and confrontation with temptations, but beneath the surface, we find a manual of spiritual initiation, a roadmap for those who wish to cross the bridge of matter and enter the realms of higher consciousness. The desert, in this context, is not just a physical place, but a metaphor for inner solitude, where there are no distractions, where the soul is confronted with its own shadows and needs to learn to hear the voice of the source. The absence of food is also the purification of the body, the release of physical and mental toxins, so that consciousness can expand without the restraints of the ego. The number 40, in and of itself, carries a huge symbolic load in spiritual traditions. It is recurring throughout the Bible and always associated with periods of preparation and transformation. There were 40 days of flood in Noah's time, 40 years of the people of Israel's pilgrimage through the desert, 40 days that Moses stayed on Sinai before receiving the tablets of the law, 40 days that Elijah walked to Mount Horeb. This pattern shows that the number 40 symbolizes a cycle of purification, death of old structures, and rebirth into a new consciousness. When Jesus retreats for 40 days, he is aligning himself with this ancestral tradition, embodying the archetype of the initiate who needs to be tested before fulfilling his greater mission. During these 40 days, the described temptations are not mere moral tests, but archetypal confrontations. Turning stones into bread is the temptation to use spiritual power to satisfy material desires, reversing the natural order of spirit over matter. Throwing oneself from the pinnacle of the temple is the temptation of vanity, of spiritual exhibitionism, the pursuit of external recognition instead of inner truth. Receiving all the kingdoms of the earth in exchange for worship is the temptation of power, of dominion over the external world at the expense of surrendering to the ego. Each of these temptations is a facet of the illusions that all seekers face on their own journey. Jesus' victory over them symbolizes the victory of the spirit over the ego, the necessary preparation to access the Christ-like state. The practice of fasting, central to this episode, should not be understood only as a physical deprivation of food, but as a process of spiritual detoxification. By emptying oneself of the immediate needs of the flesh, the mind quiets and the heart opens. It is an invitation to simplicity, purity, and detachment. Fasting is a key discipline that breaks with conditioning, showing that humans do not live on bread alone, but on every word that flows from the source. This sentence is not just a response to a temptation, but the revelation of a principle. True life is not in material appearances, but in the subtle energy that sustains all creation. Those who understand this realize that matter is merely a vehicle, and that the essential nourishment is the spirit. The desert also represents the journey from the noisy mind to profound silence. There, without the distractions of the world, the seeker confronts the screams of the ego, the inner voices that tempt him, the memories, fears, and projections. It is in the arid silence of the desert that the initiate learns to distinguish between the illusory voice of the ego and the true voice of the spirit. This process is painful because it reveals the fragility of the constructed identity, but it is absolutely necessary. Without crossing the desert, there is no preparation for ascension. It is in this void that the light finds space to shine with greater intensity. Jesus shows us through his example that the path to ascension inevitably involves confronting one's own shadows. The experience of the 40 days also points to a full cycle of spiritual gestation. Just as a child takes 9 months to form in the womb, higher consciousness requires a time of retreat to gestate. The desert is the womb of initiation. It is there that the human being, stripped of their masks, begins to be shaped by a greater force. When Jesus emerges from the desert, he is no longer the same. He returns strengthened, full of spiritual power, ready to begin his public mission. This internal transformation is what differentiates the initiated from the common man. And this same process is available to any seeker who accepts to enter their own inner desert. The archetype of the 40 days also relates to the alchemical process. Spiritual alchemy speaks of the need for calcination, that is, the burning of impurities, so that the pure essence can emerge. In the desert, Jesus goes through this very symbolic calcination. The heat, the aridity, the solitude, the fasting, everything contributes to dissolve the illusions and leave only the essential truth. This process is painful, but absolutely liberating. Just as gold needs fire to shine, consciousness needs the desert to reveal itself. It is in this hostile environment that the soul is tempered, becoming capable of enduring the light of ascension. This period of retreat and trial also teaches about the importance of discipline. Nothing on the spiritual path is achieved without conscious effort. Awakening is not a free gift, it's an achievement. Jesus shows that victory over the ego requires resilience, vigilance, and faithfulness to the spirit. He not only faced external temptations, but demonstrated how every seeker should deal with their own internal temptations, with clarity, firmness, and alignment with the truth. This is the necessary training for the soul to be ready to carry the weight of the light without being corrupted by power. Without discipline, any spiritual gift can become a trap. The 40 days also reveal to us that preparation is as important as the mission itself. Many desire results, but few accept the preparation. Jesus was only able to heal, teach, and transform crowds because he first allowed himself to be transformed. He could only lead others to awakening because he first crossed his own desert. This shows that no one can guide someone to a place where they have not been themselves. The true master is the one who has already traveled the path and, therefore, can be a beacon for others. The desert is the invisible school where the master is formed. Without this stage, there is no genuine spiritual authority. At the end of the 40 days, Jesus emerges not only stronger, but fully aware of his mission. He shows that ascension does not begin with external miracles, but with the internal victory over one's own shadows. This is the secret. Before transforming the world, one must transform oneself. Before healing others, one must heal oneself. Before freeing the masses, one must free one's own soul. The desert is, therefore, a mandatory stage for anyone who wishes to live in the fullness of Christ consciousness. Without going through it, ascension remains just a distant ideal. With it, it becomes tangible reality. The lesson of the 40 days remains alive to this day. We all face our own deserts. Whether in the form of crises, losses, illnesses, or loneliness, life repeatedly invites us to enter periods of purification and confrontation. Each desert is an opportunity for ascension. Each temptation overcome is a step towards the light. Each embraced silence is an open door to the divine voice. The secret is to understand that the desert is not punishment, but preparation. It is in the desert where true masters are born, where the inner Christ awakens, where the ascension begins. The cross, throughout history, has been transformed into the ultimate symbol of suffering, martyrdom, and pain. However, its original message goes far beyond the idea of physical sacrifice. The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the deepest narratives of humanity because it does not just describe a historical event, but reveals an initiatory process of death and spiritual rebirth that every seeker must go through on their journey towards ascension. The cross is not just an instrument of torture, it is the map of consciousness transmutation. It is the meeting point between opposites, the axis that unites heaven and earth, spirit and matter, eternal and transitory. When Jesus surrenders to the cross, he stages a cosmic ritual intended to teach humanity the path of overcoming ego and liberating the spirit. This understanding becomes clearer when we look at the Gnostic and Esoteric tradition. For the Gnostics, crucifixion is not seen as punishment, but as a symbol of the spirit's descent into matter and its subsequent liberation. Every human being, in a certain way, is also crucified in the flesh, bound to the limitations of the body, the illusions of the mind, and the chains of the ego. True redemption does not occur simply because a man died 2,000 years ago, but because this death represents the dissolution of the lower self in all of us. The cross, in this sense, is the altar where the ego is sacrificed so that the divine essence may emerge. It is a necessary death, not of the body, but of the false identity that separates us from the truth. The symbolism of the cross is ancient and universal. Long before Christ, it already appeared in various cultures as a representation of the meeting between cosmic forces. In Egypt, it was the Ankh cross, symbol of eternal life. In Amerindian traditions, the cross marked the 4 cardinal points, representing the balance of creation. In alchemy, the cross symbolizes the union of the 4 elements that, when harmonized, give rise to the 5th element, the spirit. Jesus, by being crucified, embodies this universal archetype of balance and transcendence, showing that the true victory is not in escaping the cross, but in crossing it and transforming it into a portal. Each detail of the crucifixion narrative is laden with hidden meanings. Golgotha, called the place of the skull, represents the mind, the battlefield where the true struggle takes place. The crown of thorns symbolizes the pain generated by the illusions of the mind, but also the activation of the higher spiritual center, the opening of Christ consciousness. The nails that bind hands and feet represent the human being's ties to earthly actions and paths, which need to be liberated. The shed blood is not just a sign of physical death, but a symbol of the life that is given up to fertilize collective consciousness. Everything points to a spiritual process that goes beyond the literal narrative. When Jesus proclaims on the cross, "It is finished," he is not simply accepting the end of earthly life. He is declaring the completion of an initiatory process, the victory over the forces of matter and ego. At this moment, the human drama transforms into cosmic triumph. Physical death converts into spiritual rebirth. It is at this point that the cross ceases to be a symbol of defeat and becomes the key to victory. It is at this instant that the initiate reaches the final stage of the journey, full union with the divine, the conscious return to the source. Death, so feared, reveals itself as merely a passage to true life. It's important to understand that the cross doesn't belong to Jesus alone. Each seeker has their own cross to bear. This cross represents the trials, challenges, pains, and attachments we need to face on our journey. Take up your cross and follow me doesn't mean enduring blind suffering, but accepting the process of transformation that requires the death of the old self so the new can be born. It's in confronting our shadows, our fears, and limitations that the internal crucifixion takes place. And it's only through this symbolic death that spiritual resurrection becomes possible. The Christ within each of us can only emerge when the ego is laid on the altar of the cross. The crucifixion also teaches about the power of surrender. Jesus, even in the face of pain, did not resist, but gave himself over to the divine will. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," is the ultimate declaration of trust in the source. It's the relinquishment of any human control and the total surrender to the divine flow. This is the secret of true ascension. Letting go of the ego, letting go of fears, letting go of illusions, and fully trusting in the movement of life. Surrender is not weakness, but the supreme strength that connects us to the greater truth. The initiate understands that resistance prolongs suffering, but surrendering sets one free. In the esoteric dimension, the cross also symbolizes the crucifixion of time and space. The vertical axis represents eternity, the unchanging spirit. The horizontal axis, time and matter. Being on the cross is being at the point where the eternal and the temporal meet. It is recognizing that although we live in the world of time, our essence belongs to the eternal. Jesus, by occupying this central point, shows us how to transcend duality, how to live in the world without being of the world, how to be in the flesh without being bound to it. It is in this balance that the secret of ascension lies. The cross, therefore, is the map of integration between heaven and earth. Another important aspect of crucifixion is the presence of the two thieves, one on the right and the other on the left. They symbolize the two choices every human being faces in life: to cling to illusions or to open oneself to the truth. One of them mocks and remains attached to the ego. The other recognizes his own limitation and asks for remembrance in the kingdom. Jesus' response, "Today you will be with me in paradise," reveals that salvation is not something distant in the future, but an immediate change in consciousness. The moment the heart opens and the soul surrenders, the ascension begins. Paradise is not a place, it is a state of being. The crucifixion also demonstrates the importance of sacrifice, not in the sense of imposed suffering, but in the etymological sense of the word, to make sacred. To sacrifice is to transform every pain, every loss, every difficulty into a sacred offering for the growth of the soul. Jesus turns the greatest of pains into a gateway to the greatest of victories. This teaches us that nothing we experience is in vain. Each tear can be transmuted into light. Each wound can be converted into wisdom. Each fall can become a step towards ascension. The secret is to look at the cross not as punishment, but as initiation. The resurrection, which follows the crucifixion, is only possible because there was death. There is no rebirth without something being left behind. This is the great hidden teaching. To ascend, one must die, not physically, but symbolically. One must let illusions, attachments, masks, and conditioning die. The cross is the gateway of this initiatory death, and the resurrection is the blossoming of the internal Christ, who emerges free, full, radiant, after the ego has been surrendered. This is the true victory, the true redemption, the true ascension. Thus, the cross is not just an object of worship or historical remembrance. It is a call to the courage to face oneself, to the humility of surrender, to the wisdom of transforming pain into light. Every seeker at some point will be led to their own cross. And when that moment comes, it will also be the opportunity to live the same transformation that Jesus experienced. Because the Christ who rose on the cross 2,000 years ago is the same one who desires to rise today within each human heart, willing to cross this sacred portal. Long before Jesus was born in Nazareth, the planet had already received great spiritual teachers who prepared humanity to understand universal principles. Masters who emerged in different cultures, times, and traditions, but who conveyed the same veiled truth, that human beings possess within themselves a divine spark capable of reconnecting them with the source. The life and teachings of Jesus did not occur in isolation. He was part of a lineage of light that spanned millennia, leaving traces of wisdom for the initiated. To understand this lineage is to understand that Christ's mission was not a singular event, but the culmination of a cosmic process that involved the union of various spiritual traditions at a single point of revelation. The Essenes, a group to which many scholars believe Jesus and his family were connected, were guardians of profound spiritual secrets. Living on the fringes of traditional Jewish society, they practiced purification rituals, fasting, meditation, and silence. They were known for their discipline and for keeping hidden writings, many of which were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These records reveal initiation practices, beliefs in life after death, and a spiritual vision far beyond what was taught in common synagogues. Jesus, raised in this environment, absorbed teachings that united mysticism, inner alchemy, and practices of consciousness expansion. There, he possibly learned the language of symbols, the importance of withdrawal, and the preparation for spiritual awakening. But the Essenes were not the only influence. Ancient Egypt also left deep marks on the development of occult wisdom that echoed until the days of Jesus. The worship of Isis, Osiris, and Horus conveyed narratives of death and resurrection that symbolized the rebirth of the soul. The Ankh, or Crux Ansata, represented eternal life and the union between the divine masculine and feminine. Egyptian medicine, astrology, sacred geometry, and initiation rituals were seeds that germinated over the centuries, finding fertile ground in traditions that spread throughout the Middle East. Many assert that Mary and Joseph, by taking Jesus to Egypt in his infancy, not only protected him, but also exposed him to this mystical heritage, which would later be reactivated in his mission. At the same time, India and its Vedic traditions were already discussing the unity between Atman, the inner self, and Brahman, the supreme consciousness. Masters like Krishna taught about detachment, devotion, and surrender to the divine. Texts like the Bhagavad Gita describe internal battles that resonate directly with Jesus' parables. The journey of the warrior Arjuna, guided by the Master Krishna, reflects the struggle between ego and spirit, between illusion and truth. Many researchers believe that Jesus, during his years not described in the scriptures, may have traveled to regions of India where he would have contact with these traditions. True or myth, the fact is that the similarities between his teachings and the Vedic principles are too profound to be ignored. We also cannot forget the influence of Buddhist wisdom. The Buddha, who lived about 500 years before Jesus, taught about liberation from suffering through enlightenment. His path of meditation, compassion, and detachment echoes in Jesus' teachings about loving enemies, forgiving 70 times 7, and seeking the kingdom within oneself. The Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon at Benares have resonances that reveal the unity of spiritual truth. Just as Buddha abandoned the pleasures of the world to seek enlightenment, Jesus traversed the desert to quiet the mind and connect to the source. Both are part of the same universal current of masters awakening humanity to higher realities. In Greece, philosophy was also paving the way. Socrates, Plato, and Pythagoras spoke about the immortal soul, the world of ideas, the music of the spheres, and sacred mathematics. Pythagoras in particular had initiation schools where disciples spent years in silence, studying numbers, harmonies, and proportions that revealed the hidden structure of the cosmos. This knowledge spread throughout different esoteric schools and echoes even today in Hermetic practices. Jesus, in his mission, resonated with these truths, even if he did not directly cite them. His teaching was the synthesis, to unite philosophy, mysticism, and living practice into a single path. This lineage of light also includes anonymous masters, wise men from remote villages, spiritual leaders who have never been recorded in official books, but who transmitted their wisdom through oral tradition. Each one contributed a flame, and Jesus was the torch that gathered them all into a great bonfire. He represented the convergence of traditions, the union of scattered threads of knowledge into a living and accessible code. He did not merely repeat ancient teachings, but fully embodied them, showing that Christ is the synthesis of everything humanity had received up until then. He brought clarity, simplicity, and depth to truths that had already been spoken, but needed to be lived. The hidden masters who preceded and succeeded Jesus form a continuous stream, like an underground river that never ceased to flow. Even in periods of darkness, there have always been guardians of the light preserving knowledge. Secret orders, mystical brotherhoods, monks, Kabbalists, Sufis, and alchemists have kept the flame alive. The truth could never be completely extinguished because there have always been those willing to carry it in silence. Jesus was the most luminous manifestation of this lineage, but he was not the only one. After him, others also arose, each bringing part of the same code adapted to the time and place in which they lived. Understanding this lineage is essential to realizing that Ascension is not an isolated invention, but part of a universal plan. Masters emerged to remind humanity of its divine origin and to teach that the true temple resides within each individual. Jesus is the link that united East and West, mystery and simplicity, philosophy and love, symbol and practice. He demonstrated that light does not belong to any one religion or culture, but is an inheritance for all. Christ is universal, and his message echoes beyond human boundaries. This is the strength of the lineage of light, the transmission of eternal wisdom that transcends generations, languages, and traditions. The lineage of hidden masters teaches that truth is always singular, even though it may be presented in different forms. Therefore, when we study Krishna, Buddha, Moses, Hermes, Pythagoras, or Jesus, we realize that their messages converge. All speak about awakening, loving, forgiving, letting go, silencing, and ascending. The external forms change, the symbols adapt, but the essence remains. This essence is the eternal code that leads to ascension, and it was powerfully reactivated by Jesus so that it could resonate throughout the centuries as a guide for all those who seek the light. Thus, looking at Jesus as part of a lineage of masters is to free oneself from the limited view that his mission was an isolated episode. It is understanding that he represents the culmination of a much larger spiritual project, a cosmic symphony where each master is an essential note. By recognizing oneself as part of this lineage, the seeker realizes that they are also called to be its continuity, to live and transmit the light they have received. Because the lineage does not end with Jesus, it continues in every human being willing to awaken the inner Christ and radiate this truth in the world. When Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is within you, he was not speaking in a poetic metaphor, but revealing a spiritual principle that defies centuries of religious conditioning. The kingdom is not a distant place, nor a destination after death, but an internal reality, a state of consciousness accessible here and now. This statement contains within itself a spiritual technology of immense proportions, because it completely changes the direction of the search. Instead of looking outward, towards temples, priests, or intermediaries, the seeker is called to dive within, to open the doors of the heart, and access the living presence of the inner Christ. This is the true spiritual revolution he brought, the centrality of the direct experience of the divine. The spiritual technology of Christ is not composed of external tools, but of internal practices that radically transform human energy. When Jesus taught about prayer, fasting, forgiveness, and vigilance, he was offering keys to awaken this hidden reality. Forgiveness, for example, is not just a moral attitude, but a process of energy release that breaks chains of pain, hatred, and imprisonment. To forgive is to dissolve dense patterns and make room for divine light to circulate freely. Prayer, in turn, is not a mechanical repetition of words, but a deep dive into the frequency of the divine, a direct connection to the source that recharges and expands consciousness. These principles, so simple in appearance, are powerful mechanisms for altering states of being. The inner kingdom can be understood as an energy field that already exists within every human being, but is dormant due to identification with the ego. This field is like a seed that needs to be nurtured, watered, and illuminated by conscious practice. Christ taught that, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, "Move," and it will move. Faith is the activation of this seed, a deep trust in the invisible reality that dwells within us. It's not about blind belief, but about a living experience that expands the more the seeker connects with their essence. The mountain to be moved is not external, but the internal blockages that prevent the soul from blossoming. This spiritual technology also involves vibrational transformation. Jesus demonstrated this in his encounters. His mere presence healed not only because he had supernatural power, but because his vibration was so high that it resonated with the divine core of each person. When someone touched his garment and was healed, it was not an isolated miracle, but the result of activating the Christ frequency within that person. He would say, "Your faith has saved you," indicating that the power was already within the seeker, only awakened by contact with the Christ consciousness. This shows us that Christ's spiritual technology is expansive. The more someone awakens this presence within themselves, the more it spreads and awakens others around them. The inner kingdom also manifests itself through the practice of vigilance. Jesus constantly repeated, "Watch and pray." Watching means observing the thoughts, emotions, and impulses of the ego that try to hijack consciousness. Vigilance is the key to not getting trapped by automatic patterns. When the seeker learns to observe without identifying, they begin to transcend the traps of the mind. This practice is an advanced form of meditation, where the disciple develops presence and clarity. This is how Christ consciousness strengthens, through mindful attention that dissolves illusions and allows the truth to shine. Another fundamental aspect of this spiritual technology is unconditional love. Jesus stated that the greatest commandment is to love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself. But this love is not emotionalism or attachment. It's the universal energy that binds all things together. The Christ-like love is a vibrational force that transmutes realities, heals wounds, and elevates consciousness. It does not limit itself to friends, family, or close acquaintances, but extends even to enemies, because it recognizes that all are reflections of the same source. This love is the language of ascension, the frequency that tunes the soul with the inner kingdom. The more the seeker lives this love, the more the Christ awakens within them. The parable of the vine is one of the clearest expressions of this spiritual technology. "I am the vine, you are the branches." Here, Jesus teaches that the connection with the source is what sustains spiritual life. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit without being connected to the vine, a human being cannot flourish spiritually without being connected to the inner Christ. This connection is not theoretical, but practical, lived in each breath, in each attitude, in each conscious choice. To remain in the vine is to remain in a state of presence, in tune with divine energy. This is what generates true fruits: peace, compassion, wisdom, healing, and fulfillment. This spiritual technology also reveals itself in the act of silence. Jesus often withdrew to pray alone, in mountains or deserts. He knew that silence is the laboratory of the soul, where energies reorganize and where the divine voice can be heard without interference. Silence is not emptiness, but fullness. It is the space where the inner kingdom reveals itself in all its intensity. For the modern seeker, silence remains an indispensable tool, disconnecting from external distractions, diving into the inner self, listening to the breath, observing thoughts without clinging to them. All of this awakens the Christ that dwells in the heart. Another essential point is the practice of detachment. Jesus taught, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." This does not mean rejecting the world, but understanding the order of priorities. The kingdom comes first, because it is the source of all other manifestations. When consciousness aligns with this center, the rest flows naturally. Attachment to external things causes suffering because it creates dependency. Detachment, on the other hand, makes room for true abundance to manifest. This abundance is not just material, but emotional, spiritual, and energetic. It is fullness at all levels of being. The spiritual technology of Christ is, therefore, a complete system of inner transformation. It involves purification through fasting, expansion through prayer, balance through vigilance, liberation through forgiveness, elevation through love, and sustenance through silence and detachment. Each practice is a cog in this sacred mechanism that leads the soul to ascension. What is most impressive is that all of this was conveyed in a simple, accessible, and practical way, so that anyone could apply it. There is no need for a grand temple, no need for a complex ritual, no need for an intermediary. All it takes is to open oneself, practice, and live the truth that already resides within. In the end, understanding the inner kingdom as spiritual technology is to recognize that Jesus did not come to found a religion, but to deliver a method of awakening. He brought the tools, lived the example, and left the code for the initiates. Everyone who accepts this invitation becomes a builder of this kingdom, not in a distant heaven, but within themselves, radiating this reality to the world. Christ is not an external figure to be idolized, but an internal force to be activated. The kingdom is not out there, it is here, it is now, waiting for each seeker to remember their true nature and allow the Christ light to shine without limits. For centuries, the essential message of Jesus has been shrouded in veils of metaphors, censorship, and literal interpretations that have hidden its depth. But within the canonical Gospels, the Gnostic texts, and the apocryphal writings, we find phrases, symbols, and parables that function as keys for the initiated. They are not evident messages, but hidden codes, spiritual seeds intended to awaken only those who were already ready. Jesus knew that not everyone could bear the truth all at once. Therefore, he spoke in parables, reserving the deepest revelations for the closest disciples, those who had the inner maturity to receive the teaching without distorting it. The hidden message was not made to convince, but to awaken. One of these keys appears in the Gospel of Thomas, one of the most important texts discovered in Nag Hammadi. There, Jesus declares, "The kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will know that you are sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, you will live in poverty, and you will be poverty." This passage is revolutionary. It does not speak of belief, rituals, or obedience to dogmas. It speaks of self-knowledge as the path to salvation. Those who do not know themselves live in spiritual poverty, separated from the truth. But those who awaken to their divine nature recognize that they are children of the source and already live in the fullness of the kingdom. This is the central key of the teaching. Enlightenment comes from within, not from without. Another hidden key is in John 10:34, where Jesus states, "Is it not written in your law? I have said, you are gods." This statement, often overlooked, is one of the most powerful in history. Jesus not only suggests that humans have divine potential, but asserts that they are already gods. This truth, if understood, destroys all power structures based on fear and submission. It returns to the human being their original dignity, reminding them that they are not slaves to systems, but conscious creators of their own reality. For the initiated, this phrase is a call to remembrance. Awakening the inner God is the true purpose of life. In the apocryphal Gospels, especially in that of Mary Magdalene, we find even more keys. Mary, described as the closest disciple and the one who truly understood the teaching, reports that Jesus taught about the liberation of the soul from the layers that bind it to matter. He spoke of ascending beyond the 7 powers that imprison consciousness, such as ignorance, greed, and anger. This journey is not geographical, but internal, a spiritual climb that culminates in union with the divine. This knowledge was considered dangerous because it gave autonomy to the seeker. If everyone could ascend by themselves, what would be the purpose of the institutions that controlled access to spirituality? The parable of the mustard seed is also a hidden key. Jesus said that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, but it grows and becomes the largest of trees. This symbol speaks of the power of inner potential. The seed represents the divine spark in each human being, seemingly small and insignificant, but containing within it the fullness of the universe. When cultivated, it grows and transforms all life. The initiate understands that their journey is the cultivation of this seed, the constant care, the daily practice, until the inner Christ blossoms in its fullness. The secret is not in the size of the seed, but in the quality of the soil, in the receptive and fertile heart. Another hidden message appears when Jesus says, "Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." This paradox reveals the mystery of initiatory death. To save life, in the sense of the ego, is to lose essence. But to surrender the ego, to die to illusions, is to find true life, the eternal life that does not depend on matter. This teaching is key because it invites the seeker to let go of false identities, to abandon masks, and to discover the truth that exists beyond form. It is a call to courage, surrender, and faith in the process of transformation. The miracles of Jesus also carry hidden messages for the initiated. The resurrection of Lazarus, for example, is not just the physical return of a dead person to life, but the metaphor of a dormant soul awakening. Lazarus represents the seeker trapped in the tomb of ignorance. When Jesus calls him by name, it symbolizes the call of the inner Christ, awakening the consciousness. Come out is the divine order that echoes in every human being trapped in their own shadows. This miracle is, in fact, a map for the journey of ascension, hearing the call, leaving the tomb, and walking in the light. The keys are also in the small details of Jesus' words. When he asserts, "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light," he is pointing to the awakening of spiritual vision, the inner eye, often associated with the third eye, the center of perception beyond duality. A divided eye sees illusion, but a single unified eye perceives unity. This is a direct instruction for the initiates. Unify the vision, transcend duality, and access the light that illuminates the entire being. The simplicity of the eye is the purity of the heart that sees clearly. Another fundamental point of the hidden message is the assertion, "My kingdom is not of this world." Many have interpreted this as an escape from earthly reality, but for the initiated, it means that the true sovereignty of the soul is not found in temporal structures. The kingdom is internal and eternal. It does not depend on political realms, nor on material wealth. This key teaches detachment and reminds us that the true homeland of the soul is eternity. The seeker who understands this ceases to be a prisoner of circumstances and begins to live in inner freedom, regardless of what happens outside. All these messages, scattered like fragments, form a hidden mosaic that can only be seen when the seeker looks beyond the surface. They are keys that activate spiritual memory, reminding the initiate of their true identity. They were not left to create dependence, but to awaken autonomy. They were not written to imprison, but to liberate. That's why they were hidden, persecuted, and distorted, because they threatened the power structures that wanted to keep man separated from his essence. But for those who have eyes to see, the code is still alive, pulsating in the words of Christ. The secret is that Jesus' message was never external. It has always been focused inward. He constantly pointed within. "The kingdom is within you. You are God's. Whoever believes in me will do the works that I do, and even greater." These phrases are not vague promises, but direct statements of human potential. The initiate who understands this realizes that Christ is not just a historical figure, but an inner reality that can and should be activated. This is the reserved code, the hidden key, the concealed message. Each human being is a potential Christ, waiting for the moment to awaken to their true nature. For centuries, the word ascension has been associated with a supernatural event, an occurrence reserved for saints or special beings. However, when we understand Jesus' hidden message, we realize that ascension is not a privilege for a few, but the natural destiny of all human beings. It's not something distant, separated by millennia, or only accessible after death. It's a living, continuous process that can begin here and now, in the heart of every seeker. Jesus did not just come to show what he could achieve, but to open the door so that each one could follow the same path. When he declared, "Greater works than these shall you do," he was revealing that ascension is a universal inheritance, an intrinsic possibility to the human condition. The question is not whether we can ascend, but whether we are willing to embark on the inner journey that leads us to it. Today, in an era of revelation and unlimited access to information, the rise becomes even more urgent. We live in a time where external distractions have never been so numerous, and at the same time, opportunities to awaken have never been so abundant. Humanity is going through a turning point. Social crises, conflicts, climate changes, and profound transformations at all levels reveal that we are facing a collective choice: to continue trapped in the illusions of ego, matter, and power, or to awaken to the Christ consciousness that inhabits us. Jesus left a code that can now be activated more intensely than ever, because the earth itself vibrates at a new level, propelling sincere seekers to go through their own process of transmutation. Ascension, in practice, means living in alignment with the inner kingdom. It is not a sudden event where we are transported to another dimension, but a series of conscious steps towards the light. Every choice based on love instead of fear is ascension. Every act of forgiveness dissolves densities that prevent the soul from rising. Every moment of silence, every instant of prayer, every practice of detachment is a brick placed in the construction of the inner temple. Just as Jesus traversed the desert, faced the cross, and was reborn in light, every seeker is called to live their own deserts, carry their own cross, and be spiritually reborn. The difference is that today we have access to the keys and can consciously apply the code of ascension in everyday life. The awakening of the inner Christ begins with a simple act of remembrance, acknowledging that we are already divine by nature. This recognition is not arrogance, but humility. Humility to accept that we are not just flesh and bone, but sparks of the infinite. This reminder changes the way we look at ourselves, others, and the world. By recognizing ourselves as bearers of the Christ light, we begin to see this same light in every human being, even in those who are still asleep. This change in perception is revolutionary because it dissolves the barriers of judgment, hatred, and separation. The awakened inner Christ sees unity where there was once division. The ascent also requires spiritual discipline. Just as Jesus fasted, prayed, and retreated in silence, the modern seeker needs to create spaces for practice in their life. Meditation is one of the most powerful tools for aligning the mind and heart with the inner kingdom. Inner silence is the laboratory where consciousness expands. Mindful breathing, contemplation of nature, sincere prayer, and the study of sacred teachings are technologies accessible to all, but transformative for those who practice them with dedication. It's not the quantity of practices that matter, but the quality of presence. A single moment of complete silence can open doors that years of distraction would never open. Another aspect of ascension today is the detachment from power and control structures. Jesus was persecuted precisely because he taught that there was no need for intermediaries to access the divine. This teaching continues to be challenging even today. Many systems attempt to control spirituality, turning it into a tool for manipulation. But the inner Christ cannot be imprisoned. He manifests freely in every human being who dares to seek the truth within themselves. The modern seeker is called to assume their spiritual sovereignty, to stop depending on external authorities, and to connect directly with the source. This freedom may seem scary, but it is the key to true ascension. The rise is also collective. Although the process is individual, the vibration of each awakened human being contributes to the elevation of the whole. The more people awaken to the inner Christ, the more the vibrational field of humanity rises. This creates waves of transformation that impact societies, cultures, and even the planet. Jesus knew this when he said, "You are the light of the world." Each lit light illuminates not only its own life, but also the path for others. The rise today is, therefore, a call to collective responsibility. We do not awaken only for ourselves, but to serve as beacons in the darkness. The practice of unconditional love is the foundation of this process. Loving not only those who love us, but also those who hurt us. Forgiving not just the small mistakes, but even the major offenses. choosing compassion over judgment, empathy over indifference. This love is the highest vibration that consciousness can manifest. It dissolves blockages, heals ancestral wounds, and opens doors to higher levels of perception. The inner Christ is the embodiment of this love, and the more it awakens, the more the seeker becomes a living channel of the source. Ascension is, above all, learning to love without conditions, without boundaries, without restrictions. One of the major challenges in the process of ascension today is the illusion of haste. Many want immediate results, but ascension is gradual, built step by step, choice by choice. There are no shortcuts. Jesus showed that even he had to go through processes of preparation, desert, temptation, cross, and resurrection. The modern seeker also needs to accept the rhythm of spiritual life. Each difficulty faced is part of the path. Each fall is a step towards elevation. Patience and perseverance are essential virtues to not give up in the face of obstacles. Ascension does not happen in a single leap, but in countless small flights towards the light. The ascension also involves the physical body. It's not just the mind or the spirit that participate, but the whole being. Taking care of the body, eating with awareness, practicing exercises that align energy, like yoga, tai chi, or deep breathing, are ways to prepare the physical temple to sustain higher frequencies. The body is the vehicle of the soul, and its purification contributes to the elevation. Jesus knew this when he emphasized fasting practices and simplicity. Today's seeker can adapt this principle, choosing habits that favor clarity and vitality, avoiding excesses that cloud the mind and heart. Finally, the ascension today is the realization of the inner Christ in its fullness. It is living in the world with expanded consciousness, radiating light in every word, gesture, and thought. It is transforming everyday life into a sacred space, work into service, relationships into opportunities to love and learn. It is understanding that there is no separation between spiritual and material. Everything is an expression of the same source. When the seeker awakens to this truth, they no longer live in duality, but in unity. This is the Christ-like state, living as a living channel of the divine on earth, without needing to flee from the world, but transforming it with one's own presence. Thus, ascension is not a future destiny, but a present process. Each one of us is being called to awaken the inner Christ, to activate the code left by Jesus, and to live according to this light. The past doesn't matter, nor does the distance left to travel. What matters is taking the next step, here and now. The hidden secret of ascension is not an unattainable mystery, but a reality accessible to every heart that chooses to love, forgive, be silent, and serve. Christ is not distant. He is within every human being, waiting for the moment when consciousness awakens enough to allow him to manifest. This is the final call. Ascension begins today, and it begins within you. And now, Mind Unfettered, I want to hear from you. Which part of this secret of ascension touched your heart the most? What do you feel is being born within you as you awaken to the inner Christ? Share in the comments your vision, because every word you leave here is not just an individual reflection, but a seed that joins the collective field of manifestation. The more we express our perceptions together, the stronger we make this awakening movement, and the faster we accelerate the vibration that leads to true ascension. And don't stop here. The next step of this journey is already prepared for you. On your screen, the video, The Hidden Prophecy of the Three Veils, What Only the Truly Awakened Can See continues to reveal the hidden path that connects the masters, the symbols, and the collective awakening. Click now and join me in this even deeper dive. We are together in this chain of light, and each of your comments is a flame that keeps the mission of Minds Unfettered alive.